Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I am so glad you're joining us today for our webinar, Faith and Culture, Addressing the Needs of Jewish Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. I'll introduce our presenter in just a moment, but first I'm going to go over a few technical details. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend that you log out of the webinar, return to the link in your email, and then try connecting again. That usually clears up the problem. We would love to hear from you today, so you can submit your questions anytime during the presentation, and I'm going to hold on to those until the end, and then Michelle will take your questions. We've planned about 15 minutes for those. If you don't see the question box on your screen, look for the small orange arrow on the right side of your screen. If you click on that, that'll expand the features that you have. Also, the slides that you see on the screen today will be sent to you later this afternoon as a PDF, so you'll have them as a resource. And Michelle has provided 2 handouts as well, and you can access those using, there's a handout feature. So they're both PDF files that you can download, and I'll attach those to the email this afternoon as well, in case you don't get to that. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join the live session. So we welcome those listening to the recording, and you can tell your friends to come to our website and listen to the recording if they can't make it today. So Michelle Lifton is our presenter, and she has worked with survivors of domestic violence since 1992. In 1999, she joined Jewish Family Services in Seattle to create and implement their culturally specific domestic violence program. She provided direct service to families, community outreach and education, and program development. She left JFS last year to pursue her Master's of Arts in Counseling, at which she just graduated. So we're delighted that she's with us today. And a reminder, audience members, you can send your questions to me anytime. So we're going to start with a poll right off the bat here. And Michelle, are you with me?
Sarah?
Yeah. Okay.
Hi.
So we're letting people answer the poll here.
Okay. And you'd like me to, let's
see. So I'm just going to give it another 5 seconds because I'm quick on the draw here. All right, so I'm closing the poll, and here are the results. We have 50% clergy members and 50% advocates and social workers. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Michelle, let's turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today on this webinar. So the first, I think what often gets confusing for folks, and what I wanted to clear up in the beginning, is oftentimes there's a discussion about is Judaism, is it a culture or is it a religion? And as you can see from the cartoon, I love this cartoon because what it basically, the word Yisrael, which is the Hebrew word for the people of Israel, it means one who wrestles with God. And the reason I love this slide is it pokes fun not just at how much variation and diversity there is amongst us as Jews, but the part of Jewish culture, and Judaism is a culture. It's the part of the culture that comes from trying to understand what God means and what is God's intentions for Jewish law and for the people. And that happens through debate. And at times that could show up interpersonally as being opinionated or critical, but it is a part of a culture. And as we were saying, it's a culture with a binding history, language, religion, and people. And it's a global culture, and it's ethnically diverse. Jews have scattered throughout the globe so I think situated in the United States right now, we think of Jews mostly as white people from European descent, but the reality is Judaism is across the globe, and some of the Jews, some of us have adopted the customs and ideas of the lands from where we lived. So the culture, when you're working with Jewish families, the culture from of the family that you're working with, where the family came from globally, directly impacts how the family relates to each other, how partners treat each other, husbands treat each other, wives treat each other. And when we talk about Judaism, we're also talking about a range of religious practice. Some folks are Torah observant, meaning they look at Judaism as a religion that comes directly. The Torah is literal, and that would be the Orthodox brand. And then there's folks who adopt conservative practices, reform, reconstructionist, renewal, unaffiliated. So there's a diversity amongst us about how we practice the religion. But the culture itself, whether or not somebody practices the religion, does get passed down generationally. And a piece of that diversity and a piece of holding in our mind the fact that it's a global religion is over the years. So an example is when you look at, if you talk about specifically domestic violence, and we talk about what does Judaism say about domestic violence, is it okay for traditionally for husbands to beat their wives or not, you're going to get varying opinions. A wide diverse of opinions come from the rabbinic authorities themselves as a people who wrestle with God. Coming to understand the meaning of God comes through the debate. And so over the years, the rabbinic authorities haven't even agreed themselves, and so they look at the Jewish law and they'll argue back and forth as to what was the intent of the law. And so some rabbinic authorities over the years have outlined that, you know, in the medieval century, like the conditions under which it would be okay to beat your wife, and other commentators explicitly forbid it. And that position that the various rabbinic commentators took was directly related to where they were situated in the globe and what of the host communities they resided. So how this translates to when you're working with Jewish women as advocates or even as religious leaders, it's really important to understand that for the woman herself, it's important to ask her, what does it mean for her to be Jewish, and not to make assumptions about her practice, about her socioeconomic background, about where she falls within the religious spectrum, but just to really ask her, what does it mean to her? Okay, so we're going to go on to the next slide. So often we get the question is, how common is domestic violence in the Jewish community? And there have been studies. The first survey about domestic violence in the Jewish community in the United States was actually done in 1980, and it was by Ellen Goldsmith and Betsy Giller. And since then, there's been numerous studies and surveys that none of the studies are exact, and I think lots of people could take issue to the sample size and how valid each study was. But I think it's suffice to say that we know it exists within the Jewish community, and we know that it occurs at a similar rate to the non-Jewish communities. And we also know that it occurs across all of the sectors of Jewish practice. It occurs within the Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, non-affiliated, heterosexual communities, LGBT communities alike. And when I was working at Jewish Family Service, it was interesting because it seemed like people were pointing their fingers at each other. So the non-traditional Jews, those who maybe didn't, who were in the more Reform or even non-traditional practice communities, would argue that domestic violence was more prevalent in the Orthodox communities because as a traditional community they're more patriarchal. And then I've heard from Orthodox Jews say, well, actually it's more prevalent within the Reform communities or the secular communities because because folks in those communities aren't practicing Torah. They're deviating from the teachings of Torah, and as a result aren't treating their partners as respectfully as they should. And I'm not, to this day, aware of any study that indicates it's more prevalent in one or the other communities. I think it's suffice to say that it happens amongst all of the communities, and I think we'll get into a little bit more what that looks like and why that looks like. In 2004, Jewish Women International did a needs assessment, and one of the findings of that assessment I find particularly interesting is that they found that domestic violence in Jewish families were less likely to be recognized by secular and by Jewish professionals alike. And they attributed that result to a myth that was pretty prevalent at the time, that abuse just doesn't happen in Jewish families. And I can speak personally firsthand that was my experience growing up. I was raised in the conservative movement, and I remember in 1999 when I was asked by Jewish Family Service to start their domestic violence program, I was really excited because I had worked in the domestic violence field, and to me it was really exciting to go back to my community and to look at what within Jewish culture, values, and teachings would support a communal response to domestic violence. So I could take all that I had learned from the feminist domestic violence movement and bring it to the Jewish community and work within community to come up with hopefully culturally appropriate response. So I was really excited, and I went and I called my father and I said, hey, guess what? I got this job, and I'm really, really happy to be doing this work back in the Jewish community. And my father was really supportive and loving. His response was, well, honey, that's great, but are you really going to have a job? And he was serious, and I think that really spoke to the prevalence of this belief that in Jewish homes there wasn't domestic violence. And I think over the last 17 years, my hope is that that myth has been debunked a little bit, that we've done our work, and it's less of a belief that it doesn't happen in Jewish homes. And to this, when I left Jewish Family Service last year, I would say that most of the people within the Jewish community did acknowledge that domestic violence existed, and especially amongst the younger rabbis in the conservative and reform movements, they were receiving training within the rabbinic schools talking about domestic violence. So it was definitely talked about more, and people seem more aware than they were a couple decades ago. Where I came up against the barriers, and where where we're going to move forward with this webinar, is even though people would say, yes, the myth is a myth and it probably does occur in Jewish families now, I still find that needs assessment to be relevant, because I still think it's less likely to be noticed in Jewish families. So while people might acknowledge, yes, where it's happening within the Jewish community, I don't think they spot it so readily for Jewish families, and I think that result still holds, and that was my experience. So, so what does a Jewish victim look like? This is an image of Bella Abzug. She's at a women's strike for peace protest. And if folks aren't familiar with her, she was an American lawyer, a U.S. representative, social activist, and a leader of the women's movement, Jewish woman. And I have no idea about Bella Abzug's personal life. I don't know whether or not she experienced intimate partner abuse. But I think this is a very powerful picture, because when we think about what does a victim of domestic violence look like, I can tell you that this picture of Bella Abzug is the last image that comes to my mind. So if we stop and we think about, what is the stereotype of a victim of domestic violence? I think a lot of people, the image that comes to mind is that she's timid, she has low self-esteem, she's beaten down, she's uneducated, perhaps comes from a lower socioeconomic background, everybody has their stereotypes of whether she's white or whether she's a woman of color, but all of that plays into our image of, what a victim looks like. And then we think about, what is the stereotype of someone who perpetrates domestic violence. And, in my mind, I think of, streetcar named Desired, Stanley Kowalski, uneducated, lower socioeconomic background. Again, I think a lot of racial stereotypes comes to mind of what he looks like, what a man looks like. And then if we think about the stereotype of a Jewish woman, and we look at maybe the picture of Bella Abzug, we might think of somebody who's loud, who speaks up, who's, there's some pejorative thoughts, maybe she's bossy, maybe she's controlling. If you think of the stereotype of the Jewish mother, she's in everybody's business. She's most certainly white in the stereotype. Or we can think of the stereotype of the Jewish American princess, of maybe being rich, spoiled, pampered, and again, someone who's in control. And then we go to the stereotypes of the Jewish man. Is he nerdy? Is he bookish, intellectual, maybe lacking athleticism? Who'd be scared of him, right? And all of these, to say, these are stereotypes. Obviously, they are not reality. And but when we think of these stereotypes, we have to understand that they're powerful in our minds, and that Jewish women, I can speak for myself, have internalized these stereotypes. I mean, I thought, we're raised, or at least the way I was raised as a white, middle-class, conservative Jewish woman, I was raised to think that I was, strong, I'm assertive, I'm educated. And so clearly within that, how we've internalized these images of ourselves couldn't possibly be someone who'd be in an abusive relationship. And I think Jewish and non-Jewish professionals internalize these stereotypes as well. A really great example I can think of is a couple examples. One, I worked with a woman. She was, maybe you would say your kind of image of Bella Abzug. She was very active in the community, and she was an educator, and she spoke out for women's rights, and she spoke out for humanitarian causes, and she was very assertive person. And she was married to a man who was a professor, and he was very quiet and soft-spoken and mild-mannered, and he was assaulting her, he was beating her, and he was verbally abusing her. She was, in a domestic violence situation. And they went to couples counseling, and, we all know the pitfalls of, I think, couples counseling and around domestic violence, but he admitted to having assaulted her, and still the couples counselor couldn't get past who the two people sitting in front of her. I mean, here you have this, my client was basically speaking up, saying, he's hurting me, this isn't acceptable, this isn't okay. And she was very outspoken about the abuse that was happening in the relationship. And the couples counselor basically worked with them, tried to work with them to help her not push his buttons so much. Because clearly she was the one in control, and clearly she was all of the terrible things we can think of. So so that's one example, and I really believe that, again, these stereotypes and these images kind of obscure what we see is going on. And again, and I won't go into the details if people aren't familiar why couples counseling is probably not a good idea in domestic violence situations. This is an example of it, but another way I've seen these stereotypes play out is actually in our court system. I had the experience a couple years back, literally within a month, I was helping two different ladies, two different women get a protection order, and one of the women presented as the Bella Abzug stereotype, a strong, assertive, educated Jewish woman who her partner had assaulted her, but the crux of what made her get a protection order is when he assaulted the kids, and the children had actually, one of the children had actually made a recording of the assault. So she had hardcore evidence for domestic violence, along with the recording and other various forms of evidence. She went before the commissioner and was basically denied the protection order. And it still is mind-blowing how that happened. But then the next week I went to court with another woman who didn't present as your stereotypical Jewish woman. She was more soft-spoken. She was presented pretty timid, and there wasn't a whole lot of evidence. She was definitely a victim of domestic violence, and I supported her in getting the protection order. But comparatively speaking, there wasn't the corroborating evidence that one needs usually. You don't need. Anyways, it wasn't the same amount of corroborating evidence, and she was actually got her protection order. And so, again, these are anecdotes. There's no way to prove that these barriers, I can't say full out, verifiably in a study that this is why these women didn't get their protection orders. But over the years, I've seen this time and time again. And another example in the court system is when I've worked with women who are from Israel and Israeli culture, the construction of womanhood in Israeli culture. Again, these are generalizations, but a lot of times Israeli women culturally can be very more outspoken and assertive, and anecdotally it hasn't gone well for them when I've worked with them. So I think that this is pretty powerful. So let's move on. So the roadblocks. When we talk about roadblocks for Jewish families in domestic violence, I think it's really important to be clear that a person who perpetrates domestic violence, they're going to use whatever tactics are at his or her disposal. So an example is, I've seen in Orthodox families, more traditionally observant families, where a husband was abusing his wife, he would use, oftentimes one common tactic would be to take Jewish teachings and Jewish laws and practices and be the one to define what they mean and use them to humiliate or to abuse and to control. Similarly, in non-traditionally observant families, I've seen perpetrators of abuse use other means that are at their disposal. So, for example, in one family I worked with where the husband, and he was Jewish, but he was anti-religion, he controlled his wife by absolutely forbidding her to participate in any Jewish ritual or community. And she actually rebelled against him by naming their daughter from someone from the Bible, unbeknownst to him. So that was her way of asserting her control, which I just think is lovely. He did control her through forbidding her to engage in her Jewish community and Jewish practice. So it goes both ways, and it doesn't really matter one way or the other. The fact is, it's still abuse, it's still control, and it's and both examples I give are spiritual abuse. So that said, if we were to break down headings for roadblocks, we can look at one particular, which is anti-Semitism. And the mythology that I was talking about earlier about how the belief that domestic violence doesn't occur in Jewish families, part of that mythology, and I'm just speaking partly, some of it comes from anti-Semitism. There's the way internalized anti-Semitism plays out is there is pressure historically for Jewish families to have put the best face forward. we have to show the larger world that we have it together. It's like, don't show your weaknesses, because if you do, you'll be making yourself vulnerable for attacks. And there is a tradition within Jewish communities, and I'm talking global tradition, of taking care of ourselves. Some of it was foisted upon us because of real material anti-Semitism. And that tradition of taking care of ourselves became self-preservation. There's a law, there's a rabbinic law, and it's called messier. And that law forbids one Jew from reporting the conduct of another Jew to a non-rabbinic authority. So if the way it might play out in modern day is if a husband is assaulting his wife, if the wife were to then call the police, that would, one would say, that would be violating the law of messier, because that person is reporting on a fellow Jew to a non-Jew. And it has unfortunately been used as rationale for not taking action. I haven't seen it play out so much literally, I mean, I'm talking literally, in around domestic violence, as I've seen more epidemically when there's been sexual child abuse in super religious communities. Sometimes the law of messier has been used to cover that stuff up, and it's not. I mean, the reality, of course, is I mean, not reporting abuse, whether it be domestic violence or child abuse, that in and of itself, the abuse itself violates Jewish ethics. But the other piece of messier that is important to keep in mind is there's also rabbinic law that says that Jews must observe the laws of the host community where they reside. So in the United States, where child abuse and domestic violence is illegal, observing the laws of the United States actually is part of rabbinic law as well. And so there really is, it's really debunked. There really is no rational way that you could say women can't call the police in situations of domestic violence, because I think every rabbi here in the United States, at least the ones I've worked with, would of course say that getting safety and support is in accordance with Jewish law. But to understand, you know, the point of whether or not Jewish women were raised with the understanding of messier, and we go back to the diversity of the culture, and we go back to that first slide where I said that, you know, whether you were raised, however you were raised within the religious continuum within Judaism, the cultural values do get passed down generationally. So whether or not women were told about messier, I myself was never raised with that understanding. I didn't know about that growing up personally, but I did have a sense that you don't really want to report on another Jew. I couldn't tell you where I got that. I never heard of messier before I started doing this work. But again, whether or not women were raised with that specific law understanding, we have internalized this sense that speaking out against a partner or any other member of the Jewish community, it's like telling on your family, and it could be dangerous, and it could unleash anti-Semitism. So that's important to keep in mind. I've also seen anti-Semitism play out as a tactic of control, in the sense of I've worked with a lot of non-Jewish women whose partners are Jewish, and when they would try to interrupt their partner's verbal abuse, oftentimes what they would hear from their Jewish partners was, well, you're just being anti-Semitic because this is my cultural pattern of expression, and by you not letting me express myself this way, you're not understanding my culture, and therefore you're anti-Semitic. And I think it was really important at Jewish Family Service that we worked with all families in that way, because I think it was powerful for non-Jewish women to hear from Jewish advocates, you know, actually that isn't okay in our culture. It's not okay to ever humiliate, yell, degrade, or treat anyone without kavod, which means respect. But again, as we were saying, people who perpetrate abuse, who use power and control in their partnerships, will use whatever they can at their disposal. And so that is a tool. Another roadblock, the ways that somebody who uses power and control, they could take Jewish teachings and use that to control. And so I'll give an example of that. And this is just one example, but there's a concept within Judaism, and this will be on the handout that Sarah has attached, the concept of ShalomBaidu, which literally means peace in the home. And it's an ideal in which the whole family is working together to create a home full of peace and love and support. But traditionally, because the home is the woman's domain, ShalomBaidu has been interpreted to imply that it's the woman's responsibility for keeping the peace, the shalom, and that if there isn't harmony in the home and that there's fighting, that somehow it's a failure on her part. And again, whether or not you've been raised with explicit teaching of ShalomBaidu, I can honestly say that, again, this was a new concept for me. Nobody taught me that concept. But I, was raised believing that somehow the relationships and the harmony or the disharmony of the relationships was a reflection on me. And I think it's important to note that living in a gendered society in the United States, I think oftentimes women have internalized that as women, that somehow we're responsible for the success or the failure of our relationships and our family and our children. And within Judaism, it has a particular flavor, and ShalomBaidu is definitely where that came from. So that's an example. Jewish practice is also a tactic of control that can be used as a tactic of control, and an example of that. And again, these are just examples. There are a plethora of them. But one example for Jewish practice, I would say, is the get, which is a Jewish divorce. So in Judaism, when you get married in Judaism, you have a Jewish agreement, a Kituba, which is a contract, a marriage contract. So if I were to get married in the United States, I would go to court and have a civil marriage contract, and if I wanted a Jewish wedding, I would have a Jewish contract and I would sign a Kituba. And those are separate contracts. And similarly, when one gets a divorce, you need to get it from the civil courts, but if you were married with a Kituba, you also need to get a Jewish, some folks believe they need to get a Jewish divorce too, and that's called a get. And it was initially set up to protect women, which it was actually very progressive for its time. At the time of the creation of the get, and we're talking biblical times, that wasn't, a lot of cultures didn't allow women to divorce their partners. So the point of it was that if a marriage was dissolved, there would be no question that the wife was free. So as a divorcee or as a widow, no man then had legal or economic authority over her. So again, it was very progressive for its time. The not so progressive piece of it, now that, thousands of years later, is it's monolithic. And what that means is the husband must be willing to give his wife a get. He must willingly give it to her. And so then it now becomes a tool for control. And if a husband does not give his wife a get, she becomes what's called an Aguna, which literally means chained woman, and she cannot remarry. And this is a way to keep women trapped in marriages. And it's a huge form of abuse, and it's prevalent here in the United States. Some forms of some sects of Judaism, like in the Reform community, you don't need a get to remarry, and in the Reform community, you can get a get without your partner having to give you a get. In the Orthodox community, that isn't the case, and it's still a huge problem. And some of the work we did is working with rabbis to try to help figure out how to help women get their get. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. And then another way that somebody who perpetrates domestic violence within the Jewish is to use the Jewish community as a form of control. And again, I don't think this is particular to the Jewish community. I think this is this happens in all communities. But how it plays itself out particularly in the Jewish community is, I mean, I would say that I don't believe I've ever run across anyone in the Jewish community who would ever think it was okay to abuse their partners. And as I said earlier, it's not that anybody sanctions domestic violence. I think the question then is, there's confusion as what does it look like when it walks through your door? And so I learned early on, I remember calling a rabbi and saying, you know, having a release of information and being able to, the woman wanted me to talk to her rabbi, and calling the rabbi and saying, Rabbi, I need to talk to you about what's going on in your community, and there's this, and I would identify the family, and oftentimes I got disbelief. And I was confused because I was just, you know, here I'm saying that these acts are happening, and I think at the time we even, you know, we used the terms victim, perpetrator. He was a perpetrator, and it's really problematic to give somebody a label, because I'm telling the rabbi that this member of his community, this person that he might have known since childhood, he might have known since childhood, he might have officiated at his wedding. This is somebody he prays with, he shares in family celebrations with. We're talking about humans, and we're talking about community, and we're talking about a whole spiritual life and connection. And to then say this person is a perpetrator is really limiting in the complexity of small community and of humans and of human nature. But on top of that, the abusive partner oftentimes will capitalize on their relationships within the community and on their status within the community. And as we know, you know, part of isolation is a part of power and control, and there's the literal isolation of literally keeping her locked in the house or monitoring where she goes and who she sees, but then there's also a form of social isolation, and being such the nice guy, the member on the temple board, the youth leader that everybody loves, and you know, being that way in community, and nobody then believes what happens behind closed doors. Nobody believes the horrors that happen within. And as we know, oftentimes if somebody's being abused 24/7, they are not necessarily it's hard to be your best self when you're being put down and belittled and humiliated and tortured and controlled. And so oftentimes, you know, an abusive partner can capitalize off that, right? And it becomes this dynamic. So when us as advocates are coming forward and we're saying, hey, this is the person who's a perpetrator, and the community member is like, what? He's such a nice guy, and she's a little cranky, and she's acting a little testy, and she's actually trying to control him, and it all gets very convoluted. And I think a tactic of control is to manipulate that situation. Other ways Jewish community is used to control is, you know, Jewish teachings and practices are centered around maintaining a healthy community. There's a Jewish practice or teaching called Lashon Hara, and it literally means evil tongue. And it's a prohibition of speaking slander against another person. So if somebody is going around saying, my partner's abusing me, the community can interpret this as, oh, she's just engaging in Lashon Hara, and she's trashing him to the community, and you know, and she might be a little, the delivery might be a little stressed out, because who wouldn't be, right? And so then it gets spun and used against her. And, you know, of course, you know, as we know, we can see clearly that verbal abuse is lashon hara, and that seeking help and support and safety is not. But these are ways it plays out in the community. All right, so I'm going to move on. We've talked about the roadblocks. Let's talk about the resources. Here's a list of Jewish teachings, and I've talked about some of them. So again, anything that an abusive person might, or a person who perpetrates power and control might use to control or to hurt, we can flip it and say those same practices or teachings can actually be a source of liberation and a source of beauty and inform us how to have loving, mutual, respectful relationships. These teachings that are on this slide are actually on your handout, and they're defined very clearly on the handout. But these are teachings that define relationships within Judaism, and they inform how we see ourselves and how we are to be with each other. And as I mentioned, you know, even though we might not have been explicitly taught these values, you know, depending on where you landed in your, as a Jewish person, you know, where you landed within your level of upbringing and observance, we have absorbed them. A lot of people have absorbed them. And I'll go over a couple of them. The concept we talked earlier about ShalomBaidu, how it gets used to control women, how women have internalized ShalomBaidu to think that the partner's behavior is somehow a reflection of them not being able to have a healthy, harmonious home. The flip of it is the true meaning of ShalomBaidu is, and this is across all practices of Judaism, is that everybody is actually responsible for creating peace in the home, and that it's everyone's responsibility, and that actually harming another person is clearly a violation of ShalomBaidu. Two of these other concepts I want to point out under ShalomBaidu is B'Tselem Elohim, and it means in the image of God, and it's a beautiful concept, and basically it talks about how the divine spark is within each and every human being, and each one of us, having the divine spark within us, deserves to be treated with complete respect and honor, and that we are to acknowledge the divinity within ourselves and the divinity within other people. And I think that that's a teaching that whenever you're working with a Jewish person, that this is a teaching that can be really useful in guiding our work into just sitting down and like, what does it mean to have, to B'Tselem Elohim, what does it mean to you? And take it from there. And then the other teaching, if you go down, third from the bottom, is Pikuach Nefesh, and that means to save a life. And this is the highest Jewish obligation, and it's a law that takes precedence over any other law. So the highest in Judaism, saving a life is tantamount to everything. I mean, this is what one must do. And so if someone is observing all of the Jewish laws, and an example would be, I worked with a woman who was Orthodox, and he left her, it was a completely isolating situation where he was monitoring everything she was doing. It was extremely lethal. And he left her to go to shul. It was Shabbat, which is the Friday night Sabbath, and he didn't believe she would leave on the Sabbath because she observed the laws, and the laws say that she's not allowed to drive on the Sabbath. But she knew that saving her life took precedence over violating that law, and actually that was when she violated another Jewish law by picking up the phone and calling the crisis line and actually getting into shelter. But that was completely okay because the highest law was to save herself, and that's what she did. So let's go on to the next slide. So again, just as Jewish practice can be used as a roadblock, it can also be used as a resource. And we talked about the Kituba, and that's the marriage contract. And again, extremely progressive document. And it was basically the rabbis in ancient times insisted that the marriage couple entering into the contract was for the protection of the wife. And it became a mechanism whereby, and it was, it was literally a monetary amount. It was the amount due to the wife. It came to be paid in the event of the cessation of the marriage, even by the death of the husband or the divorce. But the idea was that there would be some financial protection for women, whereas before there never was. A modern secular equivalent would be maybe entitlement to maintenance in the event of a divorce. Another Jewish practice that's a resource is the get, because women can get divorced in Judaism, and there is a belief that you can go on and have a happy life. If the life that you created with this first person didn't work out, it's okay. You deserve to go on and have another happy relationship. And then another part of Jewish practice that I think we really cannot overlook is how much comfort and healing that there is within the Jewish faith and within the practice itself. And the woman I talked about who had, violated the laws of Shabbat to get herself safe, I met with her in the shelter, and I did a abuse checklist, and I heard just the most horrific forms of abuse. I've heard a lot. I would say this was really bad, and I'm listening to the acts that were perpetrated against her, and I'm looking at her, and sitting before me was this strong, poised woman who she just exuded a calm, and she exuded a strength. And I looked at her and I asked her, I was like, how did you do it? How did you maintain your strength and your sanity amidst such terrible affliction that's just been done to your body, to your soul? And she looked at me as if I was crazy, and was like, almost for a moment there, was like, not even like connecting, like, wait, I thought you were the Jewish advocate, right? Like she didn't, it didn't compute. My question did not compute. And then she just looked at me and she's like, Michelle, Hashem. And Hashem means, it's another name for God. And it became really clear to me that her Judaism is what kept her safe and sane in such a profound way through all of the torture she had endured. And I don't think as advocates we can ever underestimate that, and how important it is that it's our role to work with women to find the practice in the community, if of course they want it. There's lots, like I said earlier, there's lots of Jewish women who don't observe and aren't religious, but for those who do, there's a tremendous amount of healing that can be done through it. And then another resource, of course, is Jewish community. And just as the community can be used to abuse, it can also be used to support. There's been so much healing that I've witnessed when I was able to call a rabbi or call upon the community to rally around a particular family. And there's a sense of strength that is, it's golden, and it's the antidote to abuse, which is just so steeped in isolation. Community really is where we can move forward. And within the Jewish community, there also is a level of accountability. Now, one of the handouts that I've created, it's looking at the Jewish practice of tshuva. And what tshuva is this isn't, again, Judaism is an ancient religion. It's an ancient practice that was set up in community to hold each other accountable. And it's basically a process. It's an acknowledgement that someone has done something wrong, and it's to say you're sorry, to confess, isn't enough. It's not enough to say, I'm sorry, I did a bad thing. It's important to acknowledge that you've done something wrong and to apologize, of course, but there's more to it than that. There's steps, there's specific steps to Kituba, which is outlined in the handout, but it's an acknowledgement that one has done something wrong, that it's a public confession of the wrongdoing to God and to the community. It involves a compensation to the victim and then requests of forgiveness. But then the other piece is you have to also avoid the conditions that caused the offense, and that when those conditions occur again, the individual needs to do something differently. You have to act differently when confronted with the same situation. And until that happens, Teshuva has not happened. And if we look at the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code for Domestic Violence Intervention Programs, they're very similar. There are modern-day teshuva, actually. The focus is on accountability of the abusive person, accountability to the community. There's an emphasis on behavioral change, and it's not solely internal psychological process. That the safety of the victim is its primary goal, but the teshuva, overall well-being of those impacted by the abusive behavior, that it's an offense to the community, in teshuva, but also in our modern practice of battered intervention or domestic violence intervention program. And an example of, so I think that that's really exciting to look at. But an example I want to give, and then we can end and ask for questions. But I talked about the get, and I talked about working with the Jewish community to help a woman receive her get. And this is really where Jewish community as a form of accountability really crystallizes in this story for me. Is I was working with this woman whose husband was not giving her a get, and she moved away from him to another part of town, to a different part of the Jewish community, and she was Orthodox, and so she was going to a different synagogue, basically, and we were trying to work with the rabbis to help talk to him about giving her a get, and he wasn't giving her a get. So one day he shows up, it's Saturday Shabbat services, and he shows up at her synagogue, and he had absolutely no business being there other than to harass and stalk her, because he didn't live at that part of the town. And the rabbi saw him, it's a small community, and at the end of the service there's announcements that are said from the pulpit and then a closing. And what's customary in the Orthodox community is on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, after people go to synagogue, they often congregate in each other's houses for lunch. They have Shabbat lunches and spend the day together. It's a day of rest and a day of community and a day of family. So at the end of the services, the rabbi gets up at the pulpit and he does his announcements, and then he says to the community, he says, there is someone amongst us sitting here who's not from this part of town. He's from blah, blah, blah synagogue, and he is here, and he's not giving his wife a get. So I want to make sure that nobody here invites him to Shabbat lunch. And that was that. And she got her get within a couple weeks. So, and it's funny because I hadn't spoken to that particular rabbi. I had spoken to the other rabbi. So when I called up the rabbi and I thanked him for what he did, and his response was, well, it was the right thing to do. And that was that. So anyways, I'm going to end here, and thank you so much for your attention and your interest, and I'm going to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. That was really interesting. So I just want to point out to folks that when I send this PDF, there are links to articles, books, DVDs, places where you can get more information, as well as the 2 handouts that Michelle has provided. So please take advantage of that. We do have a couple of questions. One is, you were speaking a lot about domestic violence in regard to battering, but how does this relate to other forms of abuse, such as psychological, financial, emotional, and sexual? And I think that you talked about some of that as you went along, because this was an early question. But do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't clear. Thank you for asking that question. When I was talking about battering, I was meaning all forms of power and control, including sexual, emotional, financial, creating a climate of control and a climate of fear, whether or not there was actual physical violence or not. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. So you were talking about the Kituba, and is there any like premarital counseling that goes along with the creation of the marriage contract?
You know, there isn't like a set rule that there must be premarital counseling. I think every rabbi has their own, I don't know of a standard. There might be, but what the Kituba itself, there's not premarital counseling that goes along with it. That said, I do know of rabbis that insist on it before marriage, which is a great movement, and actually where I think a lot of work can be done, there's a lot of room for this, is to work with the rabbis in talking about how to weave in the dynamics of power and control within the marital counseling. I think there's a lot of room to do that work on a social change level.
Yeah, because this question was specifically about bringing up domestic violence issues during premarital counseling as a way to, prevent. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I know that we talked about it when I was at Project DVORA. We did talk about doing that. It never fully launched, but I would welcome any organizational efforts on that part. I think it's a great idea.
Okay. So it looks like we're getting close to time. I'm wondering if you have any last words or final thoughts that you want to offer?
I thank you for your interest to everybody who's present, and I want to encourage folks to look at the Faith Trust Institute. I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting here at the Faith Trust Institute, but to look at the resources on your website under your Jewish resources. I know the Haggadah and the video to save a life are really wonderful tools when working with survivors, and I want to encourage folks to check those out. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Michelle. So I also want to point out to the advocates in the group, we have a book called Walking Together, Working with Women of Diverse Religious and Spiritual Traditions, which is specifically written for domestic violence advocates, and it's a really great resource. So you can find that on our website. I just want to thank you all for joining us and let you know that our next webinar is on May 25th, and it's Reverend Dr. Sharon Ellis Davis is going to be speaking about Black women violence and the abuse to prison pipeline. So that should be a wonderful presentation. And then on May 18th, we're having our online Meaningful Voices book club. So please join us for that. We're going to be talking with the author, Anne Ream, and special victim advocate, Roger Canoff is his name, and he's really fantastic. So thank you, Michelle. Thank you for doing this presentation. I hope that you all got something useful out of it. And before you leave, you're going to be asked to take a little survey as you log off here. So if you would just take a few moments, fill out the survey, give us your feedback. We'd love your suggestions of other topics for webinars. And so this concludes our presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good day. Thanks.